Ain't no need to fear me. I'm sorry, I thought you was corn.
Strange New Worlds Episode Review. I would like the review to go now. Welcome, my friends. We are back once again to discuss the newest episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. We're up to episode 2 of the second season, this one entitled Ad Astra, Aspera, and I'm going to pretend that I know Latin and I spoke that perfectly and immaculately, and I was 100% correct there, but like I said, this is the second episode, and it kicks things off where Season 1 left off, and that little bit of itty-bitty Pike stuff we had at the beginning of Episode 1 also gets tied up here. Now, before I go on too much longer, there will be spoilers ahead, so consider yourself warned. 3, 2, 1, final read alert. Let's crack on. This is the courtroom episode to determine the fate of Una Chin Riley after her arrest at the end of Season 1. This is where I personally thought we were going to pick up Season 2. Kind of a bold and interesting choice that they didn't go that way. I wasn't really 100% impressed with the opening episode this season. I thought it had some fairly decent ideas. It just wasn't put together well. This episode I personally thought was much better. There were some issues with it. There were some things I would have done better. However, my overall opinion on this episode is pretty high compared to the rest of Strange New Worlds. Do I think this is the best legal episode that Star Trek's ever done? No. Do I think it had a lot of fun callbacks and homages to prior legal episodes? Yes, and I do think it addressed the situation at large in a pretty interesting way. Pike, as you may recall from episode 1, took a shuttle and dipped out in the first 5 minutes to go and try to find a lawyer that was able to help Una. And we learn here that this is a lawyer who grew up with Una, was Una's friend. However, situations and circumstances arose that drove them apart. They haven't really spoken in a long time. And that's actually part of the problem that's going on here, because this is another Illurian. Illurians were not allowed into the Federation. They were provisionally allowed, at least a single colony was provisionally allowed to potentially join the Federation back in the day. This is the colony where Una was growing up, and we learn here that she had all sorts of childhood issues because of this. So provisional membership in the Federation meant that all future generations of the Illurians were not allowed to undergo the genetic manipulation that we know that they did, and they treated this, interestingly, in my opinion, as a cultural hallmark, a rite of passage, something that was traditional to this species, and that was basically a way for the Federation to crack down and take away this cultural heritage. That was kind of what was being presented here. Obviously, there were a lot of allegories and a lot of real-world issues kind of being tied up in this, and I think that's why a lot of people are going to be taking issue with this episode, at least some of the people I've seen. I've seen people saying that it's too preachy. It's dealing with situations that are far too close to the real world, but that's kind of the point, at least in my opinion. That's, in essence, what the original Star Trek did all the time. And maybe because we're so far away from those issues now, they don't seem like real-world issues at the time. But if you go back to some of the earlier original series episodes, they were very, very on the nose with things that were going on in modern-day society. We just have, 40, 50 years of distance from them now, so they don't feel as cutting edge. So maybe because we are so caught up in the moment, that's going to lead some people down the path of feeling like this was talking down to them. One of the other downsides I've seen about this episode is how they were portraying and representing the Federation as a whole. They were once again not presenting it in a perfect light. They were showing that the Federation is flawed, they're bigoted, they have issues, but I'm not necessarily against that as a constraint of the show, because we've seen throughout most of Star Trek that a lot of our characters, a lot of our crew members, a lot of the people we follow are stand-up members of the Federation. But when you look at the entity as a whole, they tend to have some issues. There was a lot of bad admirals. There were a lot of planets on the fringes that tend to be left to fend for themselves, or once the Federation sets up shop there, they kind of establish their rules, implement their rules, and they don't necessarily follow up with them the way they should. But there are a lot of problems shown in the Federation. While they do have lofty goals and ideals, they aren't perfect because they're not made up of perfect people, and I don't necessarily think this episode really does that much to damage the face of the Federation, because it actually shows that they have these ideals and they're working towards something better. Now, one thing that is a bit iffy to me is why everything is so human-centric, Earth-centric, and that's just a problem we've always had with Star Trek, because obviously we are humans. That's what we're going to empathize with. That's what we're going to make sense of, putting this through the filter of our own experiences. So to have all of this Federation policy stemming from an Earth situation, and only an Earth situation, seems a little bit disingenuous. However, and this is where I'm going to go ahead and defend it, this is established Star Trek canon. This is something that's been the very heart of Star Trek for a long time. Obviously, it was a throwaway thing in the original series. We didn't realize we were going to have this grand, expansive universe built upon it. It was doubled down upon in DS9, and now this is just something that's in the bones and in the fabric, in the makeup of Star Trek. So for them to weave it into Star Trek, 100% on board with that. If they were to completely drop it, like some people kind of seem to think might be the best idea, I'm sure people would also be complaining that, oh, it's breaking canon because don't you know about the genetic engineering that was mentioned in that one episode? So either way, I think they're kind of damned. So to play with it and to go with it, why not? To establish new rules and new situations that are kind of handcuffed by this situation, I actually like that, because they're exploring something that was really unexplored, and they're adding nuance and telling stories within an established universe. And those are the things that I think are perfect. You've got this playground to work within, why not work within it? So I've talked a lot before I actually got to the episode here. It's a lot of just your typical courtroom type stuff. I'm nowhere near an expert on legal stuff, so I can't speak as to whether or not this seemed realistic or not. It seemed on par with things we've seen in courtroom dramas in Star Trek before, so I'm going to go ahead and assume that it fits well within that established canon and that established universe. I mentioned I was going to get back to the whole Tellarite situation. I think that was one of the bigger missed opportunities here. Not that I'll count it as a huge down, but they went through all the time and the effort in this tribunal to show us a human, a Vulcan, and a Tellarite. Would have been nice to have an Andorian thrown in there, but whatever. And we get a Tellarite, the nice fancy makeup. The actor had a couple of lines. One of them was vaguely belligerent, but at the end of the day, they went through all of this effort to include a Tellarite and did absolutely nothing with this character, with the character Pasalk, who also gets tied into Spock. This one bothers me a little less because he is a Vulcan. Spock's father, Sarek, is high up in the Vulcan leadership, so it would make sense that this lawyer, this prosecutor, whatever he was, is somebody that would have a relationship with Spock's father, and by extension, Spock would know this person as well. And there was a great interplay, one of the few interplays that had nothing to do with the courtroom scene, where they were visiting each other on the Enterprise, and we have M'Benga and Ortega sitting down watching them, basically sitting at a table just looking at each other, not having any exchange at all. And Ortegas is doing this little, this one-woman show thing where she's coming up with the conversation she thinks that they're having, and it's very Vulcan-like. And then M'Benga's like, you know what? These Vulcans hate each other. You could tell by their subtle little facial expressions and things. And it was a nice scene, and then Spock comes over and apologizes for the horrible outburst, which obviously we, the audience, saw nothing of because they were just sitting down at a table calmly, not even talking to each other. I like that. It makes sense with the pre-established Vulcan stuff that we've seen in Star Trek. However, coming off last episode where Spock was throwing a fit, having a tantrum, crying, losing his mind, being emotional, it just seems a bit jarring because we have seen Spock just absolutely lose it. So it kind of lost a little bit of that humor to me, but I still thought it was a fantastic scene overall. We got to see some nice, cool callbacks here. We saw in that briefing room, meeting room, conference room, whatever you call it, a couple of classic Star Trek callbacks. There was a painting or an image of the Phoenix, the first human-made warp-capable vessel from Star Trek First Contact. And we also got to see, although it was a bit more blurry and hard to make out, an image of the NX-01. I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that was the NX-01 Enterprise. It could have been Columbia or one of the other ones, but it has to be the Enterprise in my opinion. So it was nice to see that callback, that reference as well, because these are pre-established parts of Star Trek canon that often get overlooked because a lot of the future shows were made first and that wasn't established yet. So it's nice to see them put back into canon and given that respect they deserve, even though it's usually just these blink and you miss it little references. They're very rarely directly referenced, and I think that's something that needs to change. Almost none of the other characters had much to do outside of Una and Pike, especially at the beginning. Most of the rest of them were just played for character witnesses, and they were sat down at a table watching the proceedings. We also got to see that La'an is now back in Starfleet, so why she left at the end of last season and then immediately came back, it's a little bit jarring, especially after last episode where April basically said she's an ex-Starfleet officer. You can't go out there flying around saving her. You need to sit here and do Starfleet things. I also mentioned the whole backstory of the Illyrians, and I think this had the perfect setup to kind of rectify the Illyrians we saw in Enterprise. It was specifically mentioned in this episode that the Illyrians have been struggling and dealing with hardships, especially because of their genetically augmented status. And this could have been, building upon the lore established here, a perfect introduction to the Enterprise Illyrians who looked different. It was even established in this episode that after a lot of moral failings on the Federation colony that Una was growing up upon, that they had to, in essence, build a walled city. One side was for the Illyrians that were modified, one side was for the normal presenting ones. And since she was normal presenting, she went with her family to hide out on the normal side, while her friend here, the other lawyer, Nira, was forced to live on the other side because she was unable to pass as a normal, non-genetically engineered Illyrian. Why is this the case? There's nothing about her image, there's nothing about her physically in this episode that makes us believe she couldn't pass as a normal human. She looks like a normal human, she acts, she sounds, so what could possibly have been the problem that would have not allowed her to present as a normal, non-genetically engineered person? The perfect solution, in my opinion, would be to give her those head bumps and those ridges that the Illyrians from Enterprise had, thus solving that little bit of a canon issue that some people have been pointing out. Maybe those head ridges were part of some genetic manipulation that was undoable. And I don't think that's a good way to say that, but maybe that was the result. And that was a sign of the genetic manipulation, and that's why she was unable to fit into the normal society. Nero was trying to get on her soapbox at the beginning of this episode and score a victory for all Illyrians and all genetically modified peoples, and kind of use this as a platform to show off and to defeat the mighty Federation. Where she eventually ended up going was to save her friend through a legal loophole. They were able to find that there is a precept in Federation law that if you are seeking asylum, there are certain factors, certain criteria in order to do so, and Una had met all of those, let alone the fact that Una is this exemplary officer, somebody that has risen through the ranks a lot quicker and a lot further than a heck of a lot of other people. Admiral April even mentioned that she was the most quickly promoted member of his crew back when they were serving together prior to Pike taking command. I also feel like I should point out that I really like these dress uniforms, the medals, all of that stuff they're wearing. I really dig that. They're obviously an upgraded, more modernized version of the uniforms that they were wearing in the original series, but they actually look legit, and I really enjoy that. Especially, I think the red version looks great to me. Overall, I think that this was a nice touchstone of an episode. I think that it told the story it was trying to tell well. It couched real-world issues in a alien culture through the lens of persecution of an alien culture, using a real-world situation, but it was grafted onto something that's not real world. You're taking the genetic modifications of an Illyrian and you're grafting on persecution from our own world, and that's the type of storyline Star Trek has told well throughout its history, sometimes not so well, but I think they did a good job here. And I also think the actress playing Nira, for some reason, struck me a hell of a lot like she was doing a speech pattern or putting on a cadence that was very much in line with the original series of Star Trek. But what did you think? Tell me all your thoughts down below. Do you think that this hit the mark? Do you think it failed completely? Are you one of those people that feels it's too preachy? Or are you kind of with me that, yes, it was 100% preachy, but so was a lot of early Star Trek? I personally thought at one point someone might just stand up and start saying the Pledge of Allegiance or something like the original series would throw in, but all your thoughts, drop them below. Like, share, do a subscribe, hit the bell, throw me some money, all of those fancy YouTube things that I'm legally obligated to say, apparently. And until next time...
Time wasn't so important, I'd show you something. My library. Thousands of books.